Welcome to What's the Truth, our podcast to explore real issues in the world today from a biblical worldview. We thank you for listening today, and I am personally excited about this conversation with Justin Mertes from Made to Flourish. Justin, thanks for joining us and taking time out of your day to join this conversation. Do you mind to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and where you live?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much. I'm honored to be on this podcast. Yeah, as you mentioned, my name is Justin Mertes. I work at Made to Flourish. We are in the greater Kansas City metro area. I am on the Kansas side with my wife, my 5 kids, and even more chickens. So we are kind of that farm-setting family in the suburbs. That's a little bit about us. And I've been with Made to Flourish going on 3 years. And we are all about helping people see their daily work as a means by which God is working in the world. And
Excellent.
So we specifically, we empower pastors and church leaders to integrate the areas of faith and work and economic wisdom for the flourishing of their communities.
When did Made to Flourish begin?
Made to Flourish began about 10 years ago. It began out of the founding president, Tom Nelson, was a pastor of a church in Kansas City and had realized in his own words, and you can read this story in the book, Why Your Work Matters, that he was committing what he called pastoral malpractice, that he was spending the majority of his time as a pastor focusing on the slimmest minority of his congregants' time. That is, he was spending most of his time thinking exclusively about Sunday morning and the programming that the church puts on, and was not thinking as much about what God had called his congregants to every single day. And that reoriented his work as a pastor, which led to sermon series and writing books, and then spun out into Made to Flourish, where we work with churches to help pastors become churches for Monday, where we focus on helping them equip the scattered church and equipping saints for their works of ministry.
Excellent. So we're talking about work and the time that people spend. You may not know this off the top of your head, but 40 hours is kind of the average. And I'm guessing probably most people, if they're actively involved in a church, are probably at a church, 1 to 2, maybe 3 hours tops a week. You're right. I mean, that's a huge difference as far as where people's time is being spent. Am I missing something, or is that kind of exactly what Made to Flourish is thinking about?
No, you're absolutely right that people are at work a third of their lifetimes. So 1/3 of their life, depending on how old someone becomes, if they work for 45 years and they work 40 hours a week for 50 weeks a year, that's 90,000 hours at work, which is significantly more time than we spend as a gathered body. And so, we would view, and I love, there's a church we work with in Pittsburgh. I love the way the pastor talks about it. He says, coming together to worship on Sundays or whenever your gathered body meets, that's halftime. Game time is what you're up to in your daily lives. And he said that sometimes churches think that Sunday morning is game time and the rest of the week is halftime. And a lot of people go through life living like that. They're thinking that Sunday morning, that's where the real work happens. And then throughout the week is largely irrelevant. And it's all just get me back to Sunday. And we would say that God has given us Sunday worship in many different ways. It is essential. It is critical. We should all be actively involved in the local church and worshiping weekly, gathering together, taking the sacraments, confessing, all these things. But we were saved for good works that God planned for us long ago. Martin Luther said that God does not need our good works, but our neighbors do. And that's what we're about, is once we go out from Sunday, it's game time. So let's get out there and let's live into the daily work God has called us to, whether that work is paid or unpaid. So we're not a workplace ministries organization where we're only focused on those who are employed. This message is just as true for students, stay-at-home parents, retirees, volunteers, caregivers, homemakers, those who are unemployed, working odd jobs that feel very little personal connection to. God still called us there. That's where God's called us. And so that's where God's at work.
It's a great analogy. You mentioned the halftime and then the game. The reality, though, is, Justin, people had to make money to survive, unless they're being supported maybe by their parents or someone else. But by and large, most people had to go make money. If I'm
Absolutely.
understanding you right, it sounds like you're saying there's significantly more to work than just making money. Is that true?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it's not untrue that we certainly need. God has put us into a world where we are able to offer goods and services and receive from them goods and services. And this economic exchange is a necessary part of being a valuable member of society, where we are providing for others and stewarding our gifts. And then receiving money for that, or receiving services, and we'll just say receiving money for that. But that's not the only part of the story. And in fact, as we talk with congregants, we hear that I'll give four examples of things that aren't untrue, but aren't the most true. So one of them is that work exists just for me to get a paycheck, which it is true that we need a paycheck, but that's not the full story. Another way that people view work is, look, the reason that I work is so I can achieve success. It's so that I can make a name for myself. Um, it's so that I can do good things.
Mm-hmm.
And we would say that is true, but that's not the only story. Another one is, it's work is the way for me to make a difference. The whole reason I work is so that I can make a real big impact in the world. That is certainly true, but it's not the full truth. And another thing that unfortunately is a narrative that we all, I think, believe a lot of time, is that work is a necessary evil. That work is a result of the fall. That if it weren't for the fall, we would all just be reading mystery novels on the beach all day long and not having to do a lick of work. And while work has been affected by the fall, work is not a result of the fall.
Yeah,
And
I
so
mean, if
each of
you,
those areas, I think we tell ourselves sometimes one way or another a story other than what God has for work.
yeah, yeah, that's. Let's go back to that list. So, paycheck, success, making a difference, a necessary evil. Those first
Yeah.
three are admirable and good if
Hmm. Hmm.
kept in check, right? I mean, I know all three could become idolatry at some point, but I
Absolutely.
think each of those have meaning and value, even for the Christian, when kept in right submission to the Lord and His authority. But number four, a necessary evil. If I'm reading and interpreting Genesis 1 and 2 correctly, wouldn't you agree that work actually existed before the fall?
I I think you hit the nail on the head there. When we open up the pages of Scripture, there are many things that we learn about God. We learn that He is merciful. We learn that He is good. We learn that He is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. We learn so many things about the character of Yahweh in the text. But the very first thing we learn about Him, other than He is pre-existent, right, in the beginning, God, so He is there, uh, that He created. The first thing we learn about God is that He's a worker, that He is a maker, He is a doer, He is active. And when He makes an image bearer, certainly one of the things that is most true of those image bearers is that they are workers, they are doers, they are active, they are co laborers with Yahweh in this great uh, project of cultivating the earth. And that happens before the fall. Yeah, Adam and Eve
Hmm.
they were given knowledge work of knowing the animals, of knowing the creation, and they were given uh, what I'll call blue collar work, if you will. They were called to cultivate. They were called to work the ground. In many ways, the scripture does not paint this picture that the Garden of Eden was perfect and Adam and Eve just sat back and enjoyed, but rather the Garden of Eden was teeming with potential, and God put little workers in it to make it into something even greater. And I would say that that's what God's up to with us now, and that's a story in Scripture that we see all the way across. Is that God's wanting to do something with His people and with this world and with the heavens, and the overlap of all three.
Yeah, I mean, I want to come back to that bigger picture of that story in just a moment,
Mhm.
God's better story, if you will. But before we do, l- talk to us a little bit about the word potential and what you mean by the potential that was in the garden. And here's the context I want to frame that question around. I think many times we can approach a job or our lives, or even from a philosophical level, economics, as this thing where like there's a limited amount that can happen or that can be done. It
Mm.
seems like though, based on what you're just saying and kind of the way I've thought through this, that there is huge potential for myself, you, everybody going to work, making a difference, and really, frankly, making this world a better place than when we found it. What did you mean when you mentioned that there was potential in the garden?
Yeah, well, I'll start with a story. So, as I mentioned, I got five kids. My middle one is a son, so he's bookended by girls.
Oh, wow.
So, so we have a playroom in our room, and all the kids play in the playroom. But my son, especially, his little maker mind operates at a really high level. He's 5 years old, and when my wife and I made that room a playroom, we stocked it with all kinds of supplies. We stocked it with staplers, tape, watercolors, tongue depressors, uh, um, Play-Doh, cardboard cutters, you name it. And the playroom itself is good. But when I put my image bearer, my son, into that playroom and let him work, he does something with the playroom that the playroom could not do on its own. He makes it a laboratory of invention. And I take delight in that, that as he grows up and is given more developed tools, he went from making books to making fidget spinners to making, I mean, just recently he was making an elaborate pulley system with yarn and string and moving things up and down from a loft that's in that space.
Hmm.
And as he explores and increases in his skill, he is able to do more. He is able to create more and bring himself more joy and satisfaction and bring me even more joy and satisfaction. And I delight in his work. And I
Wow.
like to think of the garden kind of like that playroom, that the playroom is good, but when I put my image bearer in it and he starts to make and he surprises me with what he comes up with, I just, there are a few things that bring me more joy.
Hmm.
And I think in the picture we see in scripture, we see constantly that God is putting is in his language throughout the prophets, through the Psalms, and through obviously the incarnation of Jesus. We are both pointing back to Eden, and we are pointing forward to the new heavens and the new earth.
Hmm.
And that looking back to see where we have come from and the looking forward, that's where we see that the big story of scripture is moving from a garden to a city with roads, with buildings, with canals, with a complex economy and with people who are multifaceted in their skills. It's not just two people sitting around.
Yeah.
It's two people becoming more and more, doing more and more, blessing more and more.
And that's a great story, Justin, and that really does capture, I think, what you were talking about earlier when you said the potential that is before us and before everyone when we go to work. You mentioned the phrase.
And
Go ahead.
well, I just wanted to riff on that. I've got five kids, and my son, he is a maker. His older sister, his the one that's 2 years older than her, she is an artist in a way that he is not, and so he can untap a creative engineering potential, but he does not unpack the artistic beauty potential of one of his sisters. And she does so differently from her older sister, who does so different. And so when I think of the garden, we have to remember that it was God's plan for humanity to grow. And when we think about each of us as individual image bearers having gifts that differ according to the gifts given to them, Romans 12, we say that we all have a role to play. It's not just some that do one type of work and some that do another type of work.
Well said. You mentioned the phrase garden to city.
Mhm.
Walk us through God's better story for work and help us think specifically in the categories of the creation moving all the way to heaven or the recreation.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, we see that God created all things and that all things were good. We see Adam and Eve as little priests in this temple garden where the presence of God and the presence of man are completely overlapping. They're walking with God in all of their work, in all of their decisions. and they are fully flourishing. And we've talked a little bit about that. Unfortunately, the story changes dramatically, as most of us know, in Genesis 3, where mankind uh, tried to usurp the authority of the triune God by claiming um, their own authority, by grasping at that authority, by saying we don't need God's ways, we need our ways. And we think that our way is best, doubting the promise and acting in disobedience. And in doing that, there are obviously huge implications, seismic, cosmic implications of what we call the fall. And there are three curses specifically given, and one of them is about work. And so, as we look at the rest of history until the culmination of all things, I mean, this is where I'm as much a fan of Dolly Parton and Alan Jackson as anybody else. But 9 to 5, and it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Those narratives that we may hear in our music or in our own souls that says that work is just broken. Stories of exploitation, stories of abuse, stories of single parents working multiple jobs just trying to catch a break and provide for their kids, or people who are disrespected in systems of oppression, treated unjustly. I mean, so many ways that work can be distorted. It happens at the fall. And this is the story that we live into, but it's not the only story, because as the fall happens, immediately God speaks in and says, this is not the end of the story, but there will be one who comes to crush the head of the serpent. And in this, we have this statement about the first time we hear the gospel, that there will be a Messiah who will redeem all things. And and surprisingly, God asks his people to play a part of this redemption process. We have the world created good, it has fallen, and God is redeeming it through his people. And over through the Old Testament, we have stories of people whose daily works were a means by which God blessed his people and others. I think of the story of Joseph in the latter chapters of Genesis. That Joseph, or listeners may remember the story.
Mm-hmm.
He is left for dead by his brothers, sold into slavery, and he goes and he works under Pharaoh. And in that work, in the temple of Pharaoh, um, his vocational faithfulness of interpreting the dreams, of understanding what's going on, of understanding that there are 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. In doing so, he was able to protect Egypt and set up Egypt not only to care for the Israelites, but it says that all the nations came to Egypt. And so, through one man's vocational obedience, stewarding his gifts and being faithful with what he's been called to, God blessed his people and the world. And we see that over and over in Scripture, sometimes in ways that are even shocking. I would say, namely, when the people of Israel uh, are in Babylon, when they are deported,
Mm-hmm.
and they're living as exiles. And I mean, when we think about the suffering that they have lost their family, they have seen children sacrificed to this demon god Molech. They are mocking them. You can read Psalm 137 that the Babylonians are mocking them, saying, "Sing about your God, sing." And they're just weeping by the Nile, and they're just saying, "How do we live here?"
Mm-hmm.
And shockingly, in through the prophet Jeremiah, Yahweh says to them, "Dig deep, build houses, build gardens,
Yep.
raise families, and seek the shalom of the city, because if it prospers, you too shall prosper." And so, once again, God surprisingly is saying, by you stewarding where I've put you, when I've put you, with the gifts you have, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to bless others. And this is the story that Jesus is the fulfillment of, who is obedient unto the point of death, as we hear in Philippians 2. And in doing, he blesses God's people and
Mm-hmm.
blesses everyone. And that story of redemption just keeps going through until the culmination of all things that we hear about in Revelation 21, and that Jesus talks so many times about, where the new heavens will descend, and all things will be made new in the new heavens and the new earth. There will be eternal opportunity of stewarding our gifts and worshiping God. through our activity in this new world.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the garden to city phrase. Unpack a little bit what you meant by city and how what we're moving to as Christians in this recreation actually unfolds in the setting of a city.
Yeah, the setting of a city. Now there are people who have studied this far deeper than I. So I would love to point you to some of those people. But at least as I'm understanding it even now and continuing to grow and learn and have my imagination tweaked and shaped by the Bible, we do not see that the new creation is one that is simply this disembodied celestial um, church service.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love the way that Dallas Willard talks about it. Um, he says something to the extent of, we need to get rid of this idea that we're just going to be floating around there. Uh, he says, oh, let me find that quote. He says something to the extent of saying, um, we should not think of ourselves as being celestial bureaucrats
Hmm.
involved in celestial administravia. And he jokingly says that would only be slightly better than being in an eternal church service.
Yeah.
And he says, no, we should think of our destiny as being absorbed in a tremendously creative team effort with unimaginably splendid leadership on an inconceivably vast plane of activity with ever more comprehensive cycles of productivity and enjoyment.
Wow. So well
And
said.
oh, it's so good because when we get to that, what we see is once again, God is with his people where they are working together, they are stewarding the gifts that they have been given, they are untapping the potential around them that we can't even imagine. In the same way that if I were to take my son to a construction site with all types of gadgets and gizmos and cranes, he would say, I didn't even realize that this type of productivity was possible. I think similarly, we will get to the new heavens and the new earth, and we'll say, I had never even thought that musicians will say, I had never thought about these instruments or these types of arrangements. I believe that athletes will be able to say there are new levels of feats, new feats and new competitive excellence that we can grow into. Artists, photographers, accountants, sailors, all of whom will be stewarding their gifts to the glory of God in a complex, interconnected vocational worship service that lasts forever.
Wow. Well, and all that you're saying is not just some new idea that just came out like a new website or anything. I believe if we look back at the history of the church, guys like C.S. Lewis were pointing at this same concept, certainly Martin Luther from the Reformation, and even most significantly and most importantly, this is the picture painted throughout the pages of Scripture. We are
Right.
not merely to work just to make money. And as you said, it's certainly not a necessity or a necessary evil. We're not to work just to be successful or even a good, admirable thing of making a positive impact.
Mhm,
God has
mhm.
created us to work. And I believe, as you're saying, throughout all eternity, we will be working to the glory of God. And in so doing, find our greatest and deepest satisfaction and joy. Just like you mentioned about your son, he's so much more happy making and designing and taking those raw materials in that playroom and making something beautiful out of it than he is just sitting around doing nothing. And that's true
That's
for
right.
all of us. So true.
Absolutely.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for your comments, your insight. I want to continue this conversation in a follow up episode, but for now, we need to wrap up our time. As we think about what's coming next, though, I do want to ask you some tough questions because there are some listeners who are hearing everything you're saying and they're thinking, I like what he's saying, but he doesn't know my boss. Or maybe they're thinking, I appreciate what Justin is saying, but he has no clue what I do. Like my job, if
Sure.
he only knew what I did, he would realize that
Yep.
this makes sense for the pastor types or those people
Mhm,
in philanthropic or nonprofits, but he doesn't know what I do. So I want to
mhm,
dive into some of those
mhm.
hard questions about how do you respond to that person that has a difficult, challenging boss or a meaningless task that they do over and over every day at work? And really
Mhm.
unpack, what does faithful work look like? So we'll dive into those questions during our next episode. To our listeners, thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening to this episode of What's the Truth. I encourage you to share this episode with a friend. We encourage and trust that this has been a blessing to you.